Sometimes there's a story that can be so bad and terribly executed to the point where it's downright ridiculous. But that doesn't mean it's a lost cause. It could be that a particular story isn't your cup of tea, but you can at least see the appeal and understand why people enjoy a work that you don't particularly like. And maybe once you look at things in a different light, you might find some aspects that you ironically enjoy. But then there are points where you really have to get your creative juices flowing in order to see the light. As a result, your mind could head down some obtuse places, but if you keep at it, you might discover a new, unexpected angle that makes things click. This was something I felt when I was reading I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life, a creepypasta series from Zansan90, originally posted in r/nosleep, which also was adapted into a movie that I can't find anywhere. In this creepypasta, we follow Xander, who is dared by his friend David King to ruin his life. Xander then finds himself in a series of unfortunate events that escalate further and further. Determined to put a stop to this, Xander seeks revenge against David, only playing into the latter's twisted games. The format of the creepypasta is through a series of posts in which Xander reaches out towards the audience to discuss his misfortunes and where his mindset is currently at. Now, let's cut straight to the chase. I'm pretty sure you read the title of this video and you saw the thumbnail, and you're probably thinking, Val, what in the name of Sam Hill are you doing? How could a creepypasta act as a stoner comedy, and even if that was possible, why choose this out of all things? And sure, it does sound far-fetching at first glance, but you know what? I like taking risks. So we're going to take things step by step. First, I'm going to do a breakdown of the original creepypasta and analyze its strengths and weaknesses. Then I'll compare it to a different piece of media, in this case being a stoner comedy. And finally, I'll use this newfound knowledge to recontextualize the narrative of the original creepypasta, but also keeping things respectful. In doing all this, my goal is to give some people new ideas on how to view this story differently, even if it may seem silly. In other words, let me cook. Now, if you haven't read the original creepypasta, I recommend checking it out before getting into this video, as I will be spoiling basically the whole plot. The link to the original story is in the description, so make sure to check that out and show some love to the author. With that being said, let's get right into it. So the story begins with Xander and David fucking King chilling around, feeling bored and depressed, and David starts yapping about feeling uninspired and wanting to have more structure in life. He comes across as someone who doesn't know how to navigate the world after high school. I get that, but trying too hard to sound like an intellect. At one point, David dares Xander to try and ruin his life in order to give him drive, and Xander jokingly says, "Okay, and I dare you to try to ruin mine as well." And David King is all like... Right off the bat, we see that David King has already taken this dare way too seriously, already leaving Xander at a disadvantage. For example, these two work at a theater, and Xander's all like, "I just sprinkled popcorn in the section you just cleaned." While David King's like, "Oh yeah, well I just convinced the boss to fire you, and I'm stealing your family's money and pinning it on you so they can kick you out of the house." Man, life sure is crazy. When Xander moves into a cheap apartment, David King basically ghosts him. 6 months pass, and during that time, Xander gets a girlfriend, has gotten along with his roommates really well, and has been promoted to crew trainer at McDonald's. At that point, Xander has basically forgotten about the dare, but is soon struck by what I can only describe as a streak of bad luck that sends his life in a spin. At first, these inconveniencies were rather subtle, but started gradually becoming more serious. It goes from Xander receiving an ungodly amount of junk mail to getting his social media accounts hacked, with those accounts now spamming adult material and other crude shit, to being struck with random credit card bills and suspicious activity with his checking accounts. One day, Xander's car window gets smashed, but there's a note left behind that reads, "You have to increase your minimum required effort." Oh my god, I can't read that with a straight face. On another day, Clark calls to report that their place has been robbed and is clearly upset about this, and this is when Xander mentions, "Hey, so I had this one friend back in the day that dared me to ruin his life, and now he's being really weird, and I think he's the culprit behind all this." And Clark knows what's up. So they freeze their accounts and head over to David's house to spray paint it. After spray painting Thief, David King pulls up and chases them, eventually pinning Xander down. David King then complains how Xander hasn't tried hard enough to ruin his life as much as he has, and reveals that he kidnapped Katie in order to give Xander some motivation. By the way, I don't know if I clarified this, but Xander's roommate is Clark, and his girlfriend's name is Katie. So Xander and Clark start brainstorming ideas on how to counterattack David King. Obviously, they notice they're at a disadvantage, but still map out strengths and weaknesses nonetheless. After going through a baffling method of hiding their important passwords of their bank and social media accounts by, and you're never going to believe it, by writing the passwords on slips of paper and hiding them across town. Which, I'm just... But after that, they go to the police to report David King for robbing their place, but instead, they arrest Clark for vandalizing David's house. Oh, and I think it's a good point to mention that Xander doesn't mention how Katie, his girlfriend, was kidnapped until well after the fact, which is just beyond me. Xander talks with an investigator about the situation, and they start going over how Xander could potentially turn the tides in his favor. Later, Isaac's mom, Isaac's another one of Xander's roommates, but Isaac's mom stops by the apartment to check in on her son since he hasn't been messaging her, and they enter his room and discover his corpse rotting away. And basically, Xander connects the dots to realize, oh, David King murdered someone. Cool. The apartment is closed off, leaving Xander camping out in his car alone. Later that night, he spots David King and an accomplice leaving Walmart, which prompts Xander to go back to David's place and dig through his belongings. Xander discovers a psychological evaluation of David King, which basically paints him as a killer in the making. It describes David as someone who took joy in harming living things, and puts on a fake persona as someone who's kind and gentle. At one point, the evaluation takes a 180 and is all like, man, David King's, he's such a good kid. You know, he vastly improved his behavior, and I think he should be set free. See that kid over there? The kid that, burns woodland animals and just now has been confirmed to put on a fake facade of being a kind kid? Get him out into society. He's cured. Though as it turns out, that doctor ended up being in a car accident shortly afterwards, so I wouldn't be surprised if some strings were pulled behind the scenes. So right now, Xander has gotten plenty of information about David King that he could use to his advantage. I mean, he has the evaluation as well as some USBs containing messages between David and his associate. Suddenly, Xander gets a call telling him to head towards the police station, and the news is broken to him that David King's house was set on fire with both him and his mother presumed dead, with Xander being the primary suspect. So Xander is in quite the pickle now, with a bunch of charges and felonies racking up against him. But as the police begin to drive him to the county jail to await trial, the car is suddenly hit by an armored truck. Xander is freed from the car by David King, only to have his twisted game run a little longer. He gives Xander a bag of supplies and gives him a head start to run away before he calls the cops. So Xander is on the run, keeping his head low, barely hanging on with the little amount of money he has. And during this time, he starts analyzing David King's moves from afar and how he functions both online and in real life, and finally he finds a weakness to exploit. And it's at this point in the timeline when Xander starts writing the story and posting it on Reddit, and now everyone hates David fucking King and are now spreading the word on how much of a dick he is. And not only that, but Xander has the scope on David King and threatens him through the story to face off with him, or else he'll release everything he has on David fucking King for everyone to see. And this would have been cool if he didn't mention how he was eating a sandwich at Jimmy John's. So they meet up in a factory with David King bringing an accomplice who also has Katie all tied up and scared. At that point, David goes into a monologue about how much Xander's life has improved and the skills he developed because of him, and oh, how they're not so different after all. And things start to tense up a little bit as David King shoots his accomplice in an act of insanity and threatens to take Katie's life as well unless he's given the data. And just then, Clark bursts in and a scuffle ensues, resulting in Xander getting a hold of a gun and emptying the whole magazine into David King. The story ends with Xander still being on the run, breaking down his strategies on how he changed certain details of the story to mislead David King, as well as other details that I honestly don't really care enough about to explain. But even though these past 2 years have been hell, he managed to ruin David fucking King.
Oh, brother, this guy sucks!
If I'm being honest, you can probably tell by my tone and possibly where this video is going, I'm going to be rather harsh when picking apart particular aspects of this creepypasta. Of course, I don't intend to be mean or anything like that, but there are just some gripes I have that are just too big to ignore. And the first thing I have to say right off the bat is that the way the story tries to establish mood is fucking frustrating. We've seen this narrative of two people engaging in some twisted game of cat and mouse numerous times, with some great results at that. But in order to make a narrative like that truly scary, you really have to go the extra mile. And frankly, this creepypasta doesn't have the chops to pull that off. The point in the story where we have Clark and Xander plotting in how they could take David King down should be insane, because you have David, who has proved to be relentless, who fucked around with Xander for months at this point, and has now gone as far as to kidnapping people, and the first thing these two could come up with to ruin David's life is to get him fired? Now I think I'm on David King's side now. Y'all aren't taking this seriously. But even in its intense moments, there's something in the writing and how things play out that makes things feel muddled. Sure, credit scams are scary, but I can't take it seriously because in the middle of Xander freaking out at the bank, there's basically a written PSA about how important it is to check your credit score. And when it's revealed that Katie is kidnapped, I should be on the edge of my seat. But the way these people talk to one another and how melodramatic it comes across feels more like some shit I see on the CW network with how over the top and goofy it all feels. But what makes this all infuriating is how insistent this creepypasta is on how serious it is and how we should feel intimidated with everything that's happening. But then we have a detailed breakdown on how Xander and Clark wrote their passwords on different scraps of paper that they spread across town, which, I cannot stress this enough, is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. So the tone of the narrative is left in this weird limbo where it's too melodramatic to be taken seriously, but also doesn't lean into the ridiculousness enough to become campy because, again, it takes itself way too seriously and tries way too hard to get people invested. And yes, I have seen some people online say how this genuinely gave them chills, but to me, this isn't scary in the slightest, and thus the whole thing falls apart for me. If that wasn't bad enough, there's another glaring issue that somehow makes things worse. With the way I blazed through the plotline, you would assume that this story is rather straightforward and not an 8-part series that clocks in at around 2.5 hours. Yeah, this has no right being that long. And when you look closer at the story itself, there are moments that feel like they're only there to stretch the narrative out and make the stakes seem more grander than they actually are. And this is no more clearer than in Xander's tangents. There are many moments where Xander breaks off into a tangent that screech the narrative to a halt. For example, when Xander talks about going on the run, he suddenly breaks down how hackers work. And sure, hacking's cool and all, but there are more important matters at hand here. We don't have time for a history lesson. And that's just one of many instances where Xander overly explains his actions or whatever's going on in his mind. If this happened in a couple instances near the beginning, I would probably look past it. But these moments happen so much, and as a result, take away the impact of what the story is going for. It's similar to watching some anime fight, and suddenly one of the characters has a monologue about technique and announcing their moves. Newsflash, we don't need to know every single facet that happens in a character's head, nor do we need an explanation on everything that happens in the real world, such as credit scores, the justice system, or hacking. This is because the audience can already make the connections on their own accord. Sometimes giving a breakdown or an exposition dump is fine, but they shouldn't happen this frequently, and definitely not in the middle of a heated moment. And sadly, these tangents not only take away from the serious and intense nature that the story was going for, but it also makes Xander come across as really annoying. And again, I must ask, what is the tone going for? Because you have these characters react over situations normally, such as the initial credit card scare, but then there are moments of conflict where everyone sounds like they're LARPing. Overall, the flow is very messy and often feels like it's trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. Again, I don't mean to take away from the creepypasta or show any disrespect towards the author or the fans. I'm just sharing my thoughts and my experience when I was reading this. If I were to give some compliments, I do think that the story at its core is interesting. There are some small moments that I found kind of fun, and I feel like there were points where I kind of got a laugh on how ridiculous it got. It certainly isn't boring, but it's just not quite there when it comes to campiness. Like I said, my two big issues with this creepypasta are that it struggles to maintain a specific mood, and that there are too many times where the narrative breaks off into a tangent or overly explains things. So, how could we possibly fix these issues? Or, at the very least, find ways to flip these negatives into something positive? Well, if I'm being honest, there's not much use in trying to get something serious out of it, since we already have stories like that out there. Shout out to I Saw the Devil. Maybe we could find a way to lean into its more ironically goofy side. I mean, that worked out well for The Room. But then again, I don't think that would be a good idea to lump this creepypasta in with that bunch. I feel like there's something in here worth exploring, even with its weak points and mentions of minimum required efforts. By the way, I'm never going to get over that. Minimum required effort. Is that supposed to be intimidating? That's something straight out of the Life is Strange playbook of cringy lines. Who says that? You have to be high out of your mind to say that unironically. Wait a second. High out of your mind. I can't. I daren't.
I really shouldn't.
Smiley Face is a 2007 stoner comedy about a young woman named Jane who goes on a series of misadventures after getting incredibly stoned. This isn't the first time I've covered a Greg Araki film since I've already talked about Mysterious Skin in another video, but while that one was very emotionally damaging, Smiley Face is probably one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. Anna Faris as Jane is such a lovable dumbass that has so many quotables and is basically me after I take a fifth of vodka.
Excuse me?
Nothing. Whee!
Are you alright?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
There are plenty of notable actors throughout the runtime, such as John Krasinski, Jane Lynch, Danny Trejo, and plenty more who are also really great, even if a good amount of them only appear for one scene. The movie is basically scene after scene of Jane making some really dumb decisions with hilarious results. Overall, I would go as far as to give this movie the title as the quintessential stoner comedy. It's got everything you need. Plenty of weed, a hilarious and oddly relatable portrayal of getting high, a quirky style, so many quotables, and a very brief and approachable runtime. And this is the key in fixing I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life. Don't get me wrong. I understand that at first glance this seems like me jumping the shark since these two seem worlds apart. However, there's one similarity about these two stories that made me stop in my tracks. The main characters like to talk about some random bullshit. Think about it. You have Xander over here, who, in the middle of recapping his time being on the run, suddenly goes into a lecture about hacking and how computers function for seemingly no reason. And meanwhile, you have Jane, whose mind is constantly wandering off into something random, such as how she goes from talking about framing things that you love to President Garfield. However, the main thing that separates these two is how they're presented and how they fit into their own narratives. With I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life, every time Xander decides to overly explain things or go on his tangents, it causes the progression of the plot to stall. It also makes Xander come across as pretentious and annoying when he keeps yapping and makes scenes overstay their welcome. And in a way, the tangents reflect the bigger issue of this creepypasta, in which it tries so hard to insist how terrifying it is, but as a result makes things worse. Meanwhile, with Smiley Face, when Jane's mind goes all over the place, it feels so much more natural and goes with the film's flow. And even though Jane is constantly making poor decisions, it makes sense because, well, she's high as a kite. And even then, you can't just help but find her to be such an adorable klutz. Here's what I'm getting at. While the tangents in I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life act as a detriment to the story, the tangents in Smiley Face complement it. This is because the former aims to be a grimy thriller, while the latter aims to be a laugh-out-loud comedy. So, what if we were to take this positive aspect from Smiley Face and find a way to work it into I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life? What if every time Xander starts talking about whatever, that's just the za kicking in? And what if we apply this stoned-out reevaluation to other aspects of this creepypasta, such as all the over-the-top moments and how these characters talk and act? Well, this is what I came up with. As a thriller, this creepypasta is heavily flawed. But when you look at it or reinterpret it as a dark stoner comedy, it's fucking hysterical. So picture this. You have Xander and David King getting high out of their minds, with the latter going into some tirade about feeling uninspired and minimum required effort, and this conversation eventually devolves into the start of the dare. And then there comes the following months of Xander going through all that turmoil, but instead of painting David King as some sort of unstoppable evil mastermind, he's more of a weirdo with too much time on his hands, and Xander is just really bad at handling things or doesn't take things into consideration before it's too late. Now, this could be me, but the idea of two potheads trying to ruin each other's lives with the situation worsening because one of them is incompetent sounds kind of funny. And it would weirdly fit in with some of Xander's actions, such as when he wrote down the different passwords and scattered them across town, or when he didn't mention the fact that his girlfriend got kidnapped. In fact, it would also be funny if you read it as Xander blowing things out of proportion when, in actuality, he's having trouble pulling himself together. And as for David being a psychopath, it could be that him getting intoxicated tapped into his intrusive thoughts, or maybe his dangerous behavior as a child. And maybe people like Clark and David's associate act as wild cards that escalate the situation. That way, it'll allow the unintentional ridiculousness of some scenes to blossom and complement the awkwardness of the pacing and how characters speak. But perhaps there's an underlying tragedy to this, because you have these people high out of their minds trying to ruin each other and looking like idiots in doing so, but in the end, there's still consequences to their actions. Arrests have been made, a roommate has been murdered, leaving behind a grieving mother, a kidnapping took place, and a home was set on fire, all of which are very serious in reality, but it just flies over the head of these bozos, though it just so happens that Xander is getting the short end of the stick. And perhaps while Xander is giving his testimony after being arrested for the fire, is when he starts sobering up and starts to realize how fucked this situation is. But once he ends up in that car crash and is on the run, he starts to potentially relapse and fall back into old habits. Xander then starts frantically typing the story on Reddit of all places, and by sheer luck, he outsmarts David King. And as for the shootout at the end, it could be portrayed through the eyes of Xander as an intense moment, but in actuality they're just flopping around this empty warehouse. But David fucking King is dead, and Xander is free to roam around as an outlaw, hoping that one day the charges against him are dropped. Sure, the whole thing sounds ridiculous and all over the place, but that's the point. Because now we can use the creepypasta's unintentionally goofy moments to our advantage by leaning into it even further. And again, having these characters be stoned or intoxicated in one way, shape, or form would oddly make the way they talk make more sense. Also, when looking at the grander scheme of stoner comedies, having crazy shit happen like kidnappings, a car crash caused by an armored truck, and a final shootout wouldn't be too far off. Like, look at Pineapple Express, for example. So why not view I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life in a similar vein as well? It makes for a much more interesting read that we don't really see much in the creepypasta scene. If there's something that we could learn from all this, it's that even though a creepypasta can have a lot of flaws that at times overshadow the narrative itself, it doesn't mean that all hope is gone. If a story seems ridiculous and unintentionally funny, why not lean into that side and find some enjoyment out of that? Why not take a story that revolves around a psychopath engaged in a cat and mouse game and turn it into a stoner comedy for fun? Why make everything so serious when you can laugh? Why'd I sound like the Joker there? Holy shit. However, if you already enjoyed this creepypasta as is, that's totally fine, and I'm really glad that you found more enjoyment out of it than I have. I think people should have the freedom to enjoy pieces of media in their own way as long as it's all fun and games and isn't out of spite. At the end of the day, I still had fun breaking down this creepypasta and finding different ways of looking at the story that people probably wouldn't think of. It isn't perfect, and I haven't even covered the supposed sequel because I can only take so much reading, but it's certainly a way to kill the afternoon. If you made it this far in the video, thanks for sticking around and letting me cook. Let me know in the comments what you think of my reinterpretation of this creepypasta, whether you loved it or hated it. As always, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to be notified for new videos. It's the best way to help support the channel. And be sure to join the Discord as well, where I'll be posting some behind-the-scenes work, chatting about some random stuff, and hosting some events as well. I also make drawings for any new members that join, so be sure to stop on by. Thanks again for watching. My name is Valentino, and I am outta here.